Welcome everybody to our Wednesday gathering, our final one of this semester of the spring. So we are so thrilled that you are joining us. My name is Kim Schultz, and I'm the coordinator of creative initiatives here at CTS. And we are thrilled to be hosting this book event and discussion around Moved by the Spirit, Religion and the Movement for Black Lives. And the discussion with our co-editor, our own Dr. Christophe Ringer, who will serve as moderator of this discussion with all of our wonderful guests, which I will allow others to introduce as we move forward. So just a couple notes of business before we launch in here. You come in muted. We ask that you stay muted, as is always the case in these types of things that we are so good at by this point. But when there is opportunity for discussion, which there should be at the end, and questions, we do encourage you to go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to raise your hand, either real or virtual, and engage in the discussion. That way, we also have the chat feature, of course, and we encourage you to open the chat, say hello to your friends, touch base with each other, and also feel free to respond, engage, ask questions, whatever you want to do in the chat. These Wednesday gatherings tend to have a lively chat as well, and we love that in terms of engagement. Anything we can do to make this virtual world a little bit more real. So we are so thrilled to have you with us, and I'm glad for you to join us on this Wednesday afternoon. I think that is all the business that I have to say, and we start every Wednesday of our Wednesday gatherings with what we call the words of gathering, where we invite somebody to come and speak from their faith, from their point of view, and share something that opens us and grounds us in what we're going to participate in today. And so today we are very honored and grateful to have Dr. Jose Morales Torres, who is going to open us with his words of gathering. Dr. Torres.
Hello, and again, welcome everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'll try to be brief because I think we really want to dive into the book and the themes discussed therein. And so for Words of Gathering, I thought about reading a poem by the great Gloria Anzaldúa. And the poem is entitled "To Live in the Borderlands Means You." And so I'll read that, and then we'll go from there. Here's some Spanish terms that'll come up during this poem. To live in the borderlands means you are neither hispana, india, negra, española, ni gabacha, eres mestiza, mulata, half-breed, caught in the crossfires between camps while carrying all 5 races on your back, not knowing which side to turn to, run from. To live in the borderlands means knowing that the India in you, betrayed for 500 years, is no longer speaking to you. That Mexicanas call you rajetas. That denying the Anglo inside you is as bad as having denied the Indian or Black. Cuando vives en la frontera, people walk through you. The wind steals your voice. You're a burra, boy, scapegoat, forerunner of a new race, half and half, both woman and man, neither, a new gender. To live in the borderlands means that you put chile in brioche, eat whole wheat tortillas, speak Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, be stopped by La Migra at the border checkpoints. Living in the borderlands means you fight hard to resist the gold elixir beckoning from the bottle, to pull off the gun barrel, the rope crushing the hollow of your throat. In the borderlands, you are the battleground, where enemies are kin to each other. You are at home, a stranger. The border disputes have been settled. The volley of shots have scattered the truce. You are wounded, lost in action, dead, fighting back. To live in the borderlands means the mill with the razor white teeth wants to shred off your olive red skin, crush out the kernel, your heart, pound you, pinch you, roll you out, smelling like white bread, but dead. To survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. Okay. Now I pass it on to Dean Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder.
Well, greetings, everyone. There are any number of highlights in higher education. Graduation is one of them. We at CTS are still basking, per se, in the bounty of last Friday's commencement ceremonies. Additional watershed moments in academia include when students pass their dissertation and thesis exams, faculty promotions, and of course, faculty publications. What an honor to celebrate the publishing of Moved by the Spirit, Religion and the Movement for Black Lives. I am just as honored to introduce the capable co-editors of this fine volume. As Dean at CTS, welcoming one dean to another, allow me to present Dr. Emilie Towns, who has served for 10 years as Dean at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Dean Towns is a prolific author and co-author of numerous books and a multitude of articles. Emilie is a womanist trailblazer and pace setter. Dr. Towns is also, distinguished professor of womanist ethics and society at Vanderbilt. And not to sound redundant, but again, as Dean at CTS, I am tickled by this volume as there is a trifecta of CTS handprints. There are also many Vanderbilt handprints. And as a Vandy alum, this makes me just as proud as well. Regarding the CTS imprimatur, you've met Dr. Jose Morales Torres, who is CTS Assistant Professor of Latinx Studies and Religion. Dr. Morales has an article in Moved by the Spirit. In addition, he just published his first book, Wonder as a New Starting Point for Theological Anthropology. CTS PhD alum, Dr. Teresa Smallwood is a co-editor of this volume. Dr. Smallwood is the Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology at United Lutheran Seminary. Dr. Smallwood has published any number of articles and has a book, The Bully Pulpit, Queer and Black Church, under review. She also spent some time at Vanderbilt Divinity School. The third co-editor of this work is Dr. Christophe Ringer, who serves as Associate Professor of Theological Ethics and Society, yes, here at CTS. His first book is Necropolitics, The Religious Crisis of Mass Incarceration in America. And yes, he too is a Vanderbilt alum. I now pass the Zoom mic to Drs. Ringer, Smallwood, and Towns, who will guide our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dean Crowder. And thank you to all who have joined us on this afternoon for this book launch. Dr. Smallwood and I will give some opening framing remarks regarding the volume. And then we'll have an opportunity to hear from some of our wonderful contributors about their chapters. And then we are fortunate to have this volume to be bookended by Dr. Emilie Towns and Victor Anderson, who contributed the foreword and the afterwards, both of whom are not only esteemed in our field, but also our wise guides. And then we look forward to questions from you who are gathered, to our contributors, or if there's a question regarding something that you've heard. And so we're looking forward to generative conversation. So I wanted to begin by just noting that with the emergence of the movement for Black Lives, challenging the persistent and pernicious patterns of violence, of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in our public life, from the beginning of the movement, there has always been this question or ambiguity around religion. In particular, as it relates to Black churches, Black ministers, around intergenerational tensions, around leadership, gender and sexuality, respectability politics. But we felt there was a much more complex and compelling way to think about the role of religion and the movement. And so this volume really is an attempt to think about the religious significance of the movement and the ways in which the movement is significant for religion. And so we're fortunate to have contributors who represented a wide variety of methods and approaches to this question. And the volume is really situated in what we call religious and social ethics. But again, the diversity of voices from academics, cultural critics, theologians, activists, is really something that we're proud of this volume. Dr. Smallwood?
So I certainly join with those comments and would say to Dr. Torres, the selection of that particular poem is so apropos, given the fact that we have literally expanded the concept of religion beyond borders. And this becomes for us the capacity to think greater, to have an expanse that looks beyond the denominational lines and borders that we have created, the ways in which our living and our being has been corralled through the ways that we divide ourselves. And we have really summoned the voice of those who think critically about the expanse, about the visionary ways in which spirituality and religion converge and create the kind of intersection that allows people to see the lived experience of people in a way that functions as a definition of religion greater than what we could ever imagine. And so this volume, not because I am a co-editor, but because it reads this way, is fire. And I look forward to this conversation.
So I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Brandon McCormack, whose chapter is "Today is Not My Day to Die: Public Theology, Precarious Lives, and the Politics of the Streets." If you might share just a little bit with us around how you came to this particular chapter and maybe the religious significance of protest and your relationship with Reverend Stacia Busi, if you might share just a little bit with us for a few minutes.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Christophe, and to Teresa Smallwood, to everyone who has convened us here today for this book launch. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for the invitation to contribute to this volume. I think I saw on the itinerary that we all have 3 minutes, so let me be very quick and brief, and then everybody can have a chance to talk. Really quickly, when I got the invitation to write this chapter, we were still very much in the midst of the movement here in Louisville. I mean, I think this invitation came in November or so of 2020. And I mean, that was still at the height of protests for the killing of Breonna Taylor here in Louisville. And the city had been mobilized for months and out in the streets. And I had been engaging in the streets and in the space here in the city where the center of that activity, what we would call Injustice Square. It had been called Jefferson Square Park, which was right next to the police headquarters. But we'd renamed it Injustice Square to signify on the powers that be, but also Breonna Taylor Square Park is what it also came to be known as. And so I really wanted to write this chapter in such a way that captured the energy of what was happening here in Louisville in the streets and try to talk a little bit about the religious significance of it. As you've mentioned, there's always been this tension and ambiguity about how religion has or hasn't mattered within the movement for Black lives. But what I was seeing was that religion was very much at play among the protesters and among the movement as it was playing out in Louisville. In some ways, typical ways, where you would see the pastors of the large churches who were out in the movement in ways that was really profound, because some years ago in other movements in the city that they had been more quiet, right? But I think after Ferguson, after some other movements, they had been compelled to come out, right, and be much more public and present in ways that perhaps they had not been before. But I didn't really want to focus on them. I wanted to focus on some other things that were happening that might not have been as noticeable, like this young Black queer woman, Stacey Bussey, who was out and present every day, and she was dubbed by the people, the people's pastor, right? And because of the work that she was doing there, not only leading protests, but also creating community in Justice Square, and she would call it Injustice Square Baptist Church, right? And I try to talk about that in my narrative and in the interview with her about how she was not attempting to show up as a pastor or as a religious presence, but in the midst of serving the people, right, and leading the protests, that these inevitably religious and spiritual conversations would emerge, right? And she would begin to speak to those issues amongst the people and help them to think about existential and theological questions in the midst of the movement that they were already engaged in, right? And so it was a very, really interesting relationship that she had with the people, and they affirmed her presence as their pastor. It was interesting because there were so many dynamics happening, and there would be pastors even from other cities coming in, and they would get up to speak, and I'd be in the midst of the folks, and they would say, "Oh no, that's not my preacher. No, I don't know him. I don't know who that is. Here's my pastor over here with us," right? And so she very much took on that identity. And so I try to talk about that, but I also talk about this really unlikely relationship that she forged with a young man named Travis Hamza Najdi, whose father was Muslim, mother was Christian. He was of Middle Eastern / African descent, but really identified as a nun, right? Had no particular religious commitments whatsoever until he met Stacey in the midst of protest. And really that evokes sets of conversation from him that made him rethink the role of spirituality in his own involvement in the movement. But as a young man in his early 20s, he became a central figure and leader in the protest movement here in the city. And he would lead these protests with these chants, which is where the title of this chapter came from. He would just belt out in the middle of a protest movement, "Mama, mama, can't you see?" And everybody, "Mama, mama, can't you see what the system's done to me?" And then he would say, "Papa, papa, don't you cry. Today is not my day to die." And it's that line that became the title. But ironically and tragically, not long after the height of those protests, Travis was killed on the streets. And it was largely speculated this had to do with the police because of his involvement, but officially it was because of a carjacking. Now, who knows, right, what actually happened? But the irony and the tragedy and how that really tore apart and broke up the protest community with his death. But Stacey was the one who was charged then with giving his eulogy. And it was really important and powerful for that eulogy to happen in a way that honored the specificity of Hamza's identity as both Muslim, Christian, and nun, right? But also as this leader in the movement. And it was really a moment of healing, I think, for the community to begin to heal after his death and to keep going as he was always pushing with the movement in the aftermath of that. So that narrative is really at the heart of the story. Theoretically, I'm drawing on Judith Butler to talk about assemblage, the precarity, the politics of the streets, that kind of thing, to frame up what was happening. But that's really at the narrative part of the chapter. Let me stop there, and we can allow others to talk, and we can come back and talk more about that in the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Brandon. That's a wonderful way to kind of open up precisely what the volume is designed to do, right? To really kind of open up what we mean by religion and theology, spirituality in this movement. And it's also a perfect segue to Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman. Her contribution is Slain in the Spirit, a Black womanist pneumatological aesthetic of the movement for Black lives. And if you might also give us kind of your entry point into your work, and in particular, this relationship between the performance of die-ins and what it means to be slain in the spirit.
Thank you so much, Christophe. I would like to echo the gratitude that has already been shared to both you and to Dr. Teresa for the invitation, and Dr. Towns for the invitation to participate in the volume. I had been thinking about and writing toward this very subject matter, right? Religion, theology, and the movement for Black lives for a considerable amount of time, and was just really grateful, even amidst some of the challenges that I was experiencing at the time, just grateful for the invitation somewhere to put some of these thoughts that I have had been working with. So my approach, I think, to the essay and to the subject matter more broadly begins with the premise of my work in a general sense, which is that the Black church is a moral problem. And in light of that fundamental premise of all of my scholarly interactions, I began thinking about the continuity between anti-Black state-sanctioned violence and what I study more broadly, which is violence against Black women in Black social Christianity. And because Black churches so often, you know, and I'm speaking generally here, so I mean, we can talk about specificity if we need to, but because so many Black churches kind of perform as if they own the Spirit and as if they, right, have dominion over the Spirit, and yet, right, are constantly performing violence in different ways against different kinds of people. I wanted to think about this continuity. I wanted to understand and ask, where is the Spirit? Is the Black church, right? Does the Black church have dominion over this Spirit? Or is the Spirit going where it will, right? Where is the Spirit as a theological ethicist, as a constructive theologian, as one who considers myself to be a theological aesthete? I want to know what this Spirit looks like, right? Does it look like the deacons in Black suits and the mothers in white, you know, the mothers in white, as you know, my sister, Dr. Shatavia, might say. So those were the questions, right? Who has this Spirit, right? Does the church actually possess it? And so I'm asking these questions, and I'm not a Pentecostal theologian at all, but I wanted to think about how pedestrian movement might be playing on the movement for Black lives, how movement might be a site of inquiry for thinking about the Spirit that moves, the Spirit that goes in effect where it will. And given the fact that the church has rejected so much of the movement for Black lives, particularly because of what Dr. McCormack just offered us, right? Because it is women-led, because it is interreligious, a-religious, because it is, genderqueer, right? Because of these reasons, I wanted to make a case for the Spirit not being possessed by the church, but perhaps being somewhere else. And so I looked at the pedestrian movement in the church that typifies Spirit possession, if you will, which is kind of codified in this language of being slain in the Spirit. And I compare that this kind of, and using choreographic language of descent and recovery. So descending to fall down, recovering to get up. We fall down, but we get up, right? And looking at that in relation to the die-in, which is the same mechanism choreographically, not necessarily spiritually, which is where Pentecostal scholars want to fight with me, right? But choreographically, to descend, as in to die, and to recover, right, to get up, is the same mechanism at work. And I want to suggest, and I'll stop here, that there is the presence of the Spirit in the actual descent. And it is the presence of the Spirit that rebels against the vocacity and the focus on glossolalia and language that typically guides our spirit talk as theologians and ethicists, but one that is embodied, deeply embodied, which makes this profoundly womanist. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That is so rich. And let me do this. Let me move, given what you've shared with us, let me go to Dr. Tamura Lomax, who is a foundational associate professor of African American and African Studies at Michigan State University. And her chapter is "The Black Church Movement Profile is Dead: Finding the Audacious Absurdity of Transgressive Imagination Between the American Dream and the Nightmare." And if you might also share with us your entry point and how you arrived at this chapter. And speaking of this question of where is the spirit, there's a point in your essay where you talk about a separate march that Black ministers had. And can you say a little bit about that, about why that was such a significant kind of moment for your analysis and your critique?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much to everyone, but specifically to Drs. Ringer, Smallwood, Towns, and Towns for just really this visionary and necessary project. I'm super excited to be on with you all today, but was really honored to be asked to do this work. And then particularly with all of you, I remember there was a point when we were all kind of stressed out and we all needed more time. And that's when I realized who else was a part of the project. And so I'm just very, very honored. I have to say, I'm smiling because, you know, as my sister was talking, Dr. Marshall Turman, I was thinking, gosh, were we in conversation when we were writing? Because I see so many overlapping between our works, but maybe it's the spirit that's connecting us. And so I'm glad to be coming after her because there's so many connections. So my chapter partially comes from a book chapter titled "The Talk, Public Enemy Number One, Is God a White Racist?" from my forthcoming book titled "Black Boys to Men, a Black Feminist Bible on Race, Gender, and Motherhood in America." And so when I was initially writing the chapter, America was on fire for all of us. America was on fire. And so I think I began writing the book chapter before this chapter, but America was literally on fire due to what I've called multiple converging pandemics between white supremacy, capitalism, COVID, policing, right, misogyny, while all of these things were happening at the same time. And so we were surrounded by death. And I personally was surrounded by death. People I knew, they were dying. And so Richmond, Virginia was particularly on fire, literally, like there were literally fires downtown, and we live in the city, so it's fires, all these fires. But there was also this kind of spiritual fire, this radical fire that was happening. The Confederate monuments were coming down, the marches were happening. We were all in the house due to COVID, and my eldest son, he was like, "I'm going out." And that was a moment for us because we had been cocooned here, but also, although I had been a part of social movement, I had cocooned him. And this was his moment saying, I'm a man and I am going to be, it, regardless of COVID, regardless of that, I'm going out. You guys can come with me or you can stay home. So we go with him. And what I immediately see is what I've seen at so many of these rallies is the diversity and the kind of beautifully grotesque nature of the rally. It is everybody. It's booty short, stomachs out. My son he's sagging, he got his do-rags, hats out. It is everything disrespectable, okay? And we're calling on the names of Breonna Taylor and Floyd and Justice, and we're out there, and it is marvelous. And so what I argue is that, you know, we're fighting against the American dream. The American dream is ultimately white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. That is the American dream. And what I see is that we're fighting against that, but just a few days after our rallies, the Black church decides it needs to have its own rally. In its own rally, they're in their suits, right? They're in their suits and shoes, but not are they that way? And it's hot. We're in a dead heat of summer, but they're marching with the state. They're marching with police. They're marching with the officials that we are rallying against. And so that troubled me. And I have colleagues who, proudly, posted, this is the real way to do it, right? So we were out of line. And it was very interesting because my husband's a pastor and he was out, we were out there. We were with the folks and with the do-rags and the poom-poom. We were out there with them, right? And then you have the Black church leaders, with their separate march. They didn't want to be a part of the city march. They wanted to have the separate march. And it makes sense because they were marching along with Empire. And so what I argue in the chapter is that there is a desire for access to this American dream. And part of the access to this American dream is not only capitalist accumulation, but it's also white supremacist patriarchy. So there's this desire, and I love what my sister said, and she said the Black church has a moral problem. That was that. There was this desire for respectability. We're doing it the right way. Cone critiqued it years ago when he said that basically after slavery, there was really this rejection of radical politics within the Black church. And so I draw on Eddie Glaude's essay where he says that the Black church is dead. And what I say is that the Black church movement profile is dead. This singular story about the Black church leading the movement and having the singular voice, that is dead. And if the Black church in fact wants to come alive, it has to recognize that, first of all, we are all prey in the neocolonial state, right? There is no special access that Black men or Black male pastors have to empire, right? So we're all prey, but also the Black church cannot lead the liberation efforts as long as it is invested in the American dream, which centers heteropatriarchy, heterosexism, violence, dominance, respectability, compliance, accumulation, and on and on and on, and including white forgiveness, right? Over and against the radical politics of the nightmare, because what I argue is that the nightmare against the American dream is our radical spirit, what Sister Eboni was talking about. It is this radical spirit of rebellion. And so the Black church, as long as it is, really grasping for, some sort of a part of the American dream, it cannot lead us. But lastly, if it does, in fact, because I do think there's hope, we still do need the Black church. If it does, in fact, desire to come alive in the way that it says it has, and the way and to align with the narrative that it offers in terms of being central to social movement, right? If it desires to live up to that social justice recounter in the 21st century, it must begin an emphatic rebellion against both white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and aspirational Black capitalist patriarchy, both of which pose a threat to Black freedom. It has to reject that. It has to reject notions of middle-class respectability. It has to reject the idea that sex and gender are secondary and that race and Black masculinity is primary. It has to reject the idea that white supremacist violence towards Black folks serve as some sort of evidence of some sort of specialness for Black folks, right? Because it's pivotal to the Christian story. It has to go back and begin to look at our theology and really rethink some things, which is what the moment called on me to do. And ultimately, what I'm asking also in the chapter is God on our side? Because in that moment, I did not feel like God was on our side fighting on behalf of the oppressed. So there's a lot that we need to begin to rethinking.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tamura. So we're going to go to Reverend Leah Daughtry, who I believe is here. And she is a 5th generation pastor and bishop, serving as presiding prelate of the House of the Lord Churches. She is a nationally recognized strategist, activist organizer, a self-proclaimed political insider and faith leader. And given what the kind of critique of the Black church as both a moral problem, its desires and aspirations, and then the note of hope that Dr. Lomax left us on, your chapter very much is called Walk Together Children, Lessons in Unity. And you're trying to reclaim something. If you could say just a little bit about your entry point into your chapter and what it is you think we might be able to reclaim in this moment.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I, like my sisters who have, and my brother who has gone before me, and I'm honored to be able to participate in this conversation, and also to lend my voice to the volume itself. I am not a classically trained theologian, and so listening to all of the multisyllabic words, I feel woefully inadequate. However, I am a preacher, so therefore, my entry point is, as you said, I'm a 5th generation pastor, Pentecostal by tradition and by choice. And when I listen to much of what we talk about in terms of the Black church, that's not a church that I recognize. That's not a church that I claim. It's not the church that raised me. The church that I grew up in, that my grandfather founded 100 years ago, and then we have churches across the country, is a church that is birthed in activism. And we see that as part of our theology, an integral part of how we understand who God is and who God calls us to be. And so one of the things that I try to argue in my chapter through the lessons in unity based on the things that we have ourselves experienced in our living out a Christian identity is what it is to be the remnant church, what it is to be the radical church, and what I would say what it is to be the church, period. And so a lot of what I want to argue is that we need to redefine church, and we need a different definition, because we ourselves say the Black church as if that is the church. And I would say that that is the imposter, and the church that many of us advocate for, work through, that show up at the rallies. And I say in my chapter, there is always that church where people know to go, and that church where the funeral is going to be, and that church that's going to host the rally, because the people in the community recognize that church as the moral authority and as the place of gathering and as the place of hope and healing and welcoming. And so that's where I come to this conversation, having lived what it is to be the daughter of an activist minister where, we had to have security, and there were bullets shot in our house at night, and there were, we were the place where people came. And that's how I came to this identity of understanding that for the liberation of our people, multiple strategies are required. And as long as the goal is the same, it's okay if you've got an inside strategy and an outside strategy. And that is in fact what is needed in order to press for liberation for our people. We've all got to work together. I think as church people, I think it's important for us to remember, I was reflecting, I was in Birmingham pre-pandemic, and I was at the Civil Rights Museum. And there's an exhibit on the civil rights movement in that time, and the marches, and Dr. King, and all of the things that we like to reference when we are talking about history. And there was an exhibit that caught my attention that said, during the time of the Birmingham movement, there were 700 churches, 700 Black churches in Birmingham. Only 60 were engaged in Dr. King's movement. 60 out of 700. I think that epitomizes what we find in the biblical text. There's always a small number. There's always a remnant that is true to and that adheres to the understanding of God as a disruptor, as a change creator, as a change bringer. And the rest, there's always going to be a majority. So I don't concern myself with them other Black church robe wearing people. That's not the real church for me. I'm looking for that church, the church that is the disruptor, that understands God and the Holy Spirit as disruptive forces in our personal lives and in the lives of community, if we can band together and move in alignment with that God and with that Holy Spirit. And so those are the lessons I try to lift in my chapter. Real things that we've had to do, whether it is marching and protesting against police abuse of power and the killing of children, starting with Clifford Glover's, which was when I was a little girl. He was 11 and he was killed by the police. And he's fresh on my mind because we just had a street renamed after him last week. all these many years later, to how do you build facilities, a healthcare facility? How do you work to bring that kind of revolution to Black people where they can get their healthcare needs met? That is godly. That is theological. That is disruptive, to have people be able to have healthcare that they need in their community at prices they can afford, at hours that they can go. And then how do you work with the classically activist, not religious community, and how we were able to build those bridges and build those bonds. And in the end, my conclusion, which you can read in detail, is that we're not so much divided. We're not that divided. We have the same goals. And how do we see ourselves in each other to create bonds and to create mechanisms and create real community, which is what God desires, in order to move our people forward.
Thank you so much. Your sentiment reminds me of Dolores Williams, who drew a distinction between the Black church and the denominational empirical churches, right? To try to make that kind of move. I'm going to ask that Dr. Jose Morales, I'm going to ask him to forgive me. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. And so if I could just open it up at this point, I do want to make sure that we make time for questions, and also to have Dr. Towns and Anderson to say some words as well. I also want to acknowledge we have some other contributors here, Dr. Forrest Harris, as well as Dr. Herbert Marbury. And if there are some other ones, please make yourself known. But just want to open it up for general questions at this point from those who are gathered. I just want to check the chat here. Okay. So let me do this. Dr. This is the book available? Yes, it is. We'll put that information in the chat with the discount code as well. I did want to offer Dr. Towns and Anderson just a few minutes just to give some remarks, and then we'll return to conversation. They were generous enough to provide the forward and the afterword to the book. Dr. Towns, do you want to say a few words?
I'll say a very few, because I really want to hear any questions that are in the audience. And to begin with, a thank you to both you, Christophe, and Teresa, for inviting me to join you in this project. It was for me a high honor, and I mean that very, very deeply. I remember when I was, this is the old woman talking now. I remember when I was at your stage in my career, and the kind of nervousness I had in talking to senior scholars about joining a project. So I want to thank you both for being fearless and allowing me the honor of being a part of the vision you had for this book. And I must say, it is a marvelous creation. The scope of the chapters, the way that our colleagues have come forward in that great image that Renita Weems once gave me, we must come in walking like a lion. That's what this book does, in saying unequivocally, I don't know where you've been, but Black lives do matter. And to say that is a revolutionary statement and a radical statement, because they both are at the heart and soul of what it means to be human. So thank you both, and thank you to all of the contributors of the book. It's rare I have a good time reading a book. And I have to say, reading the different chapters in the book, and the creativity of how folks are able to bring forth truth in this book, I think is absolutely marvelous. So kudos to everyone and deep thanks from me.
Thank you so much. Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, thank you, Christophe, Teresa, Emilie. I have to say, when you asked me to do the afterwards, I was very shy about answering you back. And that's only because what you were dealing with was so massive, so comprehensive, and so immediate. That is, I think we all were feeling the weight of the collective violence that was hanging over our culture, period. I appreciate this book extremely because it breaks out from the North American context explicitly to look at collective violence over Black lives as a global epidemic. That is, and it touches across the boards of faith, spiritualities, and the like. That's what makes this book a very unique book in religious criticism. I especially was intimidated because of so many of you who were my students, but also my colleagues, and I felt like a grandfather having to thank his great grandchildren. So, but that was the honor that you bestowed upon me to have that last word on the significance of this book. I would just end by saying this: the book represents what I recall the best of religious criticism. It doesn't just look at the dark sides and makes us cry. It also instills in us that great sense of spirituality and transcendence that we call hope. I think that is the great message of this book. I thank you for allowing me to be a part of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Victor. So to those who are gathered with us, if there are things that you're turning over in your head, in your spirit, you want to ask, you want to raise, please, our contributors are here to be in dialogue with you. If there's something that you want to raise, please do so.
Christophe, if I may, while we're waiting for people to formulate their thoughts, I want to first say to the contributors, you have really enfleshed for me even greater understanding about what this book can and will do as we move forward. And one of the things that I really want to point out is that as Emilie is moving toward her retirement from the deanship, the work that Brandon did in this book, and at least one other person, but Brandon's work focuses on Stachel Bussey, who participated in our work at Vanderbilt, which was the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. And Brandon so beautifully and eloquently brings out the capacity that Stachel walked away with from her attendance at that institution, at that institute, and how she is now in a PhD program. And I want to highlight the fact that we have a responsibility to do community engaged theological religious studies work, because it plants seeds, those seeds get watered, and God does bring the increase. And the question is, who's God and for what nation and all of those things. But certainly that work is an attribute, it attributes to the great legacy of Emilie Towns as a visionary, as a woman who has given herself not only to the academy in exceptional ways, but to the community as well.
Let me just echo, thank you for saying that, Dr. Smallwood, and let me echo that that word of praise for Dr. Towns. That I didn't talk about that in my opening remarks, but you're right. The Vanderbilt Public Theology Project was really at the core. There is no Stachel Bussey as leader of the movement in Louisville without her attendance at that Vanderbilt Summer Institute. It just doesn't happen. In that conversation with her, she is a fresh grad of Louisville Seminary with her MDiv, but certainly doesn't think of herself as a theologian, doesn't think of herself as a scholar, doesn't think of herself as an activist. She is encouraged by a friend to go to the Vanderbilt Summer Institute. She doesn't feel like she belongs, like so many of us. I remember when I first went to Vanderbilt as a grad student, had imposter syndrome. Oh, these are the real theologians. These are real intellectual scholars. I don't belong here. But she stuck with it. And what she left there with was just a sense of not only intellectual capability, but just emboldened to walk out into those streets and to claim her own, again, as a young Black queer woman who wasn't supposed to be out there to be the religious leadership of the space, right? That was supposed to be the pastors who led the mega churches, right? And they played their role, but certainly she was empowered by Vanderbilt to come into her own and own that space in those ways, and to be able to know what to do with someone like Travis Najdy, right? And to be able to empower him to claim his own voice, and then know how to utilize him and send him home right, in a way that healed the community and allowed them to keep on moving after his tragic and untimely death. So yes, shout out to the Vanderbilt Public Theology Project and for Dean Towns and Dr. Smallwood for organizing that.
I want to say a word, if I can, Forrest Harris, about the honor of being a part of this volume as well. It's good reading. I don't usually read a book through, pick it up day after day until it's complete, but I did with this book after I got the essays from the other contributors. What I come away with, even in this conversation, is that moved by the Spirit creates liberatory spaces. And that was the emphasis of my essay, is how liberatory spaces get created in and beyond the church. And the commitment, not so much to liberate the Black church, but to liberate Black people, to liberate oppressed people. And that liberating power and energy that came through the Black Lives Matter movement is what captivates me, is that we have had a tradition of creating liberatory spaces for our people's human agency to have full and complete expression. So I want to thank everybody as well, and thank the co-editors for allowing me to contribute in the volume. But I've just been enriched by what was said and what this volume is going to mean. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. And we have two questions, and just briefly, I want to mention our volume is called Moved by the Spirit, and in this moment, Kim Schultz is the representative of the Spirit who has informed me that at 1 o'clock, for those who have to leave, we understand, but we do have a few more moments after that. So the Spirit is going to extend our time for those who are able to stay just for a little bit longer. We have two questions, Dr. Phyllis Shepard and then Malene Johnson.
Thank you. Like everyone else, I wanted to say thank you so much for this volume. I had been thinking about something for two things. One was, what book would I use beginning in May for my own devotions? But what reading? And this is the book. This is the book that is taking me through May. And it's raising all kinds of questions for me, both theological, vocational, but spiritual as well, in terms of the work I'm called to do. I'm also using the book for the course I'm teaching in the fall, Nonviolence in Theory and Practice. And I'm wondering how you all, as you think about public theology and racial justice, how are you thinking about that red thread that can run through this work in terms of nonviolence? And as a response to those who say, it's time to become violent.
I'm going to open that up, and any of our contributors want to respond to that question.
So I may be in the minority here, but I'll start by just saying, I don't know if it's time. It's been violent, right? So there's that. It's been violent, and Black people have been on the losing side of that for all of modernity. I think that, I'm crafting a theology of defiance right now for my next book project. And sometimes I think that it requires like a theology of self-defense is actually viable. And so I don't know what I say to nonviolence, because I think that there's somewhat of a fiction to that, to the point that the points that have been made earlier when we think about this counter march by Black churchmen, Black clergy persons happening in Richmond, when we think about the aspiration toward whiteness and the ways that aspiration toward whiteness and white power, patriarchal power especially, is is a master literally of erasure and invisibilization. I think that when we kind of can grasp that, we can also understand how nonviolence, even when we think of it through like a classic Kingian tradition, was a fiction. And I think that we have to tell the truth. And I think that part of telling the truth is to tell a narrative about perhaps the moral viability of defending one's bodily integrity, and the moral viability of defending not just our children, of course our children, but ourselves too. And I'll stop there because I'm not a nonviolence advocate.
Thank you. Thank you. Others?
I'm not a skilled historian. I certainly use history in my work. But as I'm scanning through the history I can recall, I can't think of a time where Black violence worked in the long run for real, lasting, structural social change. So for me, that is one of the key reasons why I don't think it's time for violence, because its effect has always been, as near as I can recall, temporary. When all is said and done and we look back, we've not really seen a difference in how the structures of the country work, how the church itself works, none of those things. So I'm happy to be corrected, but somebody help me if I'm wrong.
So I just want to clarify that I'm not calling for violence in case it read that way, but I am calling for the moral viability of self-defense, which could potentially mean violence. And I think that although I think it's absolutely right, because we don't have the most guns and we don't have right, like Black violence, even that is troubling, right, has not worked historically. But I think that it has self-defense has something to say about dignity. It has something to say about humanity. It has something to say about some moral principles that may be interpreted differently from the the underside, or from the side of opacity. So I do want to be clear about the distinction, and also that I strongly stand by self-defense as morally viable.
I want to go to Dr. Johnson, but if I could just add one thing briefly, I do find often within theological education, there is a kind of historical erasure of the deacons for self-defense and certain kinds of movements that, especially within abolitionist circles, that often don't show the ways in which there's been a range of responses. And in many ways, the kind of, I always refer to violence and nonviolence as kind of the last respectable binary. Now, all the other binaries we critique relentlessly,
Right.
but that one is one that we want to kind of hang on to. But there is I think historically, there's a certain kind of erasure that we perpetuate. So just wanted to add that. Dr. Johnson?
Thank you, Dr. Ringer and Dr. Smallwood and the editors of the volume and all the contributors. I look forward to reading it. I'm curious about whether or not in your conversations with each other, or if anyone is thinking about the place of extra church orientations in this approach to movement. And I'm thinking about Dr. Lomax's statement about the church, in order for it to come alive, it must reject notions of respectability, as well as the other statement about going back and rethinking about our theology or the church's theology. But more broadly, has there been conversation among this group about the place of other extra church orientations?
Malene, when you say extra church orientations, just to be clear, other religious traditions, or other kinds of secular organizations?
I mean other religious traditions such as Ifa, Lukumi, Conjure, all of the above, Candomblé. Where do those fit? And African Americans, particularly who are practicing these traditions, in response or as a response to some of this violence that we're talking about and these useless aspirations toward the American dream, for example.
Respond, and I'm going to kind of merge your question with responding to the other question. I've not seen it, but I do call for it. I do feel like, well, historically, you think about the ancestors, they knew that they didn't have the power of the state. They knew that the laws were not protecting them. So when prayer didn't work, they, held on to conjure. Even the most Bible toting of those who were Christians, right? I think about Nat Turner was definitely a Bible Christian. When he still carried around a charm in his pocket. So they knew that they had to call upon these other forms of Black religiosity. And what I call for, not in the chapter, but in the book that inspires the chapter, is that we need to get back to that and really have an openness that I think really Gen Z has, this openness in terms of different forms of African spirituality, like calling on the ancestors. We need to, our prayers, I'm arguing, are not enough, right? And neither is our nonviolence. And so I think about distinctions between one of my heroes, which is Ella Baker, and Dr. King, is that Ella Baker was not nonviolent, right? And so being nonviolent does not mean one is calling unviolence. It is the idea that violence is a possibility, particularly as Dr. Marshall Turman says in terms of self-defense, right? Sometimes you just gotta let folks know. I think about even Frederick Douglass, right? Having to praying, and finally asking for some charms and conjure to fight his master, right? And he had to let Mr. Covey know. Sometimes you gotta let a person know, right? Not to mess with you. And so, yes, there violence, we don't have the weapons, we don't have, but sometimes, there has to be a moment of reconciling, and saying, we just got, I understand there's going to be a punishment for this, maybe even death. That's what the ancestors know. And I think that's what makes us different than them. They knew that death was a possibility, and they were open to that. I'm not calling for death, but I do think that we really need to begin to think more critically about this notion of nonviolence, which I feel is rooted in respectability, because we're actually not nonviolent. We're violent to each other. We're violent to Black people. We're violent to queer people. We're violent to Black women. We're violent to Black boys and girls. There's violence all the time. We see terrible violence all the time in media of a Black person being beat down by another. So we're not nonviolent. We use that when we're talking about the state. So we really need to rethink about this notion of nonviolence and how we're using it. And I get it. We don't have the guns and we will probably die. I get it. But I do feel like we're getting to that point where we will have no other choice, but our backs are against the wall. We're literally getting to that point where we will have no other choice but to come out fighting and knowing that death is on the other side. And so in that, I do say that we need to call on everything that the ancestors were calling on, and it was a mixture. It wasn't just Jesus.
Malene, if I could also offer, although there's not a chapter specifically focused on Candomblé, one of our contributors, Scott Williamson, really draws on indigenous traditions as a way of critiquing the restorative justice movement, right? He critiques the movement to say there are some inadequacies to address the forms of harm, and he draws on various kinds of indigenous traditions in order to do that work. So I wanted to point that out as well.
And if I could point out something, it's very important for us to not just try to theorize around self-defense, but to understand the capacity that we have in the law. Because people are constantly trying to up the ante on what you can and cannot do to defend yourself. And I think it's important. Brandon put in the chat about we will shoot the Akinyi Umoji book, but there are lots of ancestors who've written about the use of arms. Okay, and Negroes and the gun, we will shoot back. This nonviolent stuff will get you killed. Negroes with guns. My point is to say, I don't think nonviolence is really the question, because we're talking about an old frame in one way. What we're really talking about is the capacity to survive. Now, Audre Lorde said we were not meant to survive, but I say we are meant to survive. Live to fight another day, whatever it takes.
There's the conundrum there, right? And I think that Tamura lifted that up. And the conundrum is, it's like Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon, you can't kill me, I'm already dead, right? It's this idea that, this may be somewhat pessimistic and I'm not a pessimist, but right, the idea that the violence is empirical, it's everywhere, right? We are already in the wake, right? As Sharp might say, we're already there. And so, I mean, right, where is hope if we're already there? And sometimes the hope might be to live to fight another day, but knowing, right, that in fighting, you might, right, you might just die. You might go out to that march and not come back, which is why, right, which is why Lomax goes with her son in maybe one instance, right? But that really is the reality of being Black today. We might go to church and not come back. We might go to campus and not come back, right? And so death is this very real thing. So I think that's the conundrum, and wanting to live, wanting this world without end, in other words, this kind of white realized eschatology, but the end is now. Maybe, I don't know.
Which brings us back to the spirit in a very significant way. This notion that Leah brings up, and the idea that there is fire, but what kind of firepower? What kind of firepower?
One thing I appreciate about this conversation is that there is, in my experience, in many abolitionist spaces, there's a piety that's often present that tells a story of abolition from slavery to the present without mentioning the Civil War. Right? There's a way in which they talk about the history of abolition without running up against the limits of moral suasion. So I think this is a really interesting conversation. It's very present because there are often, again, in many abolitionist spaces, certain kinds of assumptions about nonviolence within an abolitionist kind of praxis.
You know, I want to say Herbert Marbury, one of the contributors to the book, and I think Phyllis, you and I have talked about this question of nonviolence a few times, and I know you pose it seriously, but you also pose it as a part of an exercise. And I think it's important that we think about it. But I want to argue that it is at one level artificial. It is not a question that we put to white supremacy. It is not a question that we put to those who terrorize the vulnerable. It is for us a red herring that we are forced to focus on and to make this artificial choice. In my own article, I look at the spiritual Mary, Don't You Weep, and the ways that we have read the Bible through the spirituals and sung the spirituals through the Bible. And the story in the book of John, Mary and Martha are grieving, and the New Testament offers us this nonviolent resolution, the resurrection of Lazarus. But that's not the way our ancestors sung the song. That's not the way they read the text. They read the text, and anachronistically, as exegetes would call it, but they read the text. They read the Hebrew Bible as a solution to a New Testament problem. And the solution was Pharaoh's armies were drowned in the Red Sea. That is not a nonviolent solution, but it is a solution. It is a solution that dismantles empire and thinks about the ways that Black lives must survive. And I think that for us, it offers us the message that we ought not focus on the red herring, that we ought to focus on what Black lives mean, and reimagining the value of Black lives beyond the ways that white supremacy offers us these kinds of impediments that really don't serve us.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating conversation, but thinking back with Dr. Turman and her initial conversation about the spirit and whether or not the Black church owns the spirit or has, some regulatory force over the spirit. Might we imagine a spirit that comes upon us in such a way that moves us towards some type of act of self-defense for the sake of our own dignity and that of our community that might in fact be violent? Can we imagine being moved by the spirit in that way? I mean, I think it's a question that I think we have to wrestle with. I mean, if we think with Nat Turner, if we think with any number of abolitionists, to Christophe's point, I think we have to think about whether or not the spirit, or we can envision a theology of the spirit that can at least include the possibility of violence. It's interesting to me because I was going back and forth with a doctoral student that I just brought to defense, who did his dissertation on Malcolm X, that he entitled the dissertation "To Hell with That Religion," right? And it was on really the necessary violence of the overthrow of the state, in which he wanted to argue for. And we went back and forth about this, and I wanted to press him. And I was, bringing up counter arguments about nonviolence and things, but he was very steadfast in his position about the necessity, right, of violence in this moment, right? And I think so many other folks are there. And have been there, as you said before, the ancestors have been there. Akinyele Amoja's book on "We Will Shoot Back" has been there in the necessary self-defense of protecting the community against white supremacists, marauders, and the like. But even as I was thinking about this, Tamura Lomax, I was just thinking, we were grad students in Nashville, right? Your husband Michael, at the church when he pastored, they would open up the church basement to houseless folks, and sometimes we would do shifts there, and we would stay overnight. And I remember staying there overnight in the church with one of the old deacons. I can't remember this brother's name, but I remember walking with him through the church basement at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, "You do this all the time?" He's like, "Yeah, every now and then we have some issues." He's like, "But I don't worry because I know I ain't by myself. I ain't alone in here." And I thought it was a proclamation of piety, right? And I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, deacon." And then he lifted up his shirt, He's like, because I got this piece on me, right? It got me, because if anything goes down, right, you know, we're going to handle that in the name of Jesus, right? And so there was just really just this complexity, right, of these kinds of ways that we frame violence and nonviolence among our community, but that our elders and ancestors have in fact embraced that complexity and the possibility, right, that it could be a very spiritual act to defend oneself against threat, and to do so having been moved by the Spirit.
I just put in the chat the first statement in the Black Christian Nationalist Creed by Albert Cleage, which states in part, in terms of the Holy Spirit, God's creative power is visible in the mysteries of the universe in the revolutionary Holy Spirit, which will not long permit men to endure injustice or wear the shackles of bondage, in the rage of the powerless when they struggle to be free, and in the violence and conflict, which even now threaten to level the hills and the mountains. So we have understood that to be a part of our tradition for a long time.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about the discussion is bringing to the fore the complexity of talking about nonviolence. Brandon, the story you just told reminds me of, I'm forgetting her name right now, who did the book on Fannie Lou Hamer, who said she showed up at every protest, everything they were doing organized without any weapons, but she had 4 shotguns in her bedroom, 1 in each corner. And in a conversation with Reverend Lawson about that, I said, what do you think about that? He goes, absolutely. She lived in the middle of the KKK. She had to be ready to protect her family. And I'm certainly not suggesting that is the solution for everyone, but I do think what you're helping me think about, particularly for the class, is that violence and nonviolence has to be understood as a cultural expression, a strategy of trying to kill off Black and brown people, and as a strategy in terms of the way I look at the legislatures the body that's going on right now in Tennessee. And we could say, you know, using the power of elected officials, using the power to silence Black, queers, everyone, definitely is violence. And how do we respond to that strategically? I don't think showing up at Capitol Hill with all our guns is going to do it.
Yeah,
Well,
Dr. Shepard, let me just say the last thing, because I've spoken too much, but I hope in that class as a resource, you will play that clip from the documentary film, The Black Power Mixtape, where Angela Davis is there and they're interviewing her, and she just looks incredulous, like, violence? You asking me? I mean, it's just the way, you asking me about violence? Just that 2-minute clip, right? I mean, just sets the tone for all the conversation, I think, for a semester's worth of discourse about that, because Angela Davis just runs it down. I'm from Alabama, right? And she just, I mean, opens that discussion up so beautifully.
my bishop's wife made the comment, I got something for a prayer meeting and I got something for a bear meeting. What kind of meeting do you want to have?
Well, liberatory spaces, using that theme again, have never been created without violence. It has been an advocacy, activist approach and strategy that developed around how people push forward a new sense of agency that for some responded violently to Black life all the time, but Black people themselves. So I think it's contextual. You have to really think through what and how it plays out in any context.
Mm-hmm.
We are quickly coming to the close of our time, and wanted to thank all of you, the contributors. One, just I also have to say, writing in the midst of multiple pandemics is not easy. The emotional toll, and so just a deep thank you to the contributors for what you've shared in this volume, and to those who have gathered here today. What you've heard is just a snippet I really want to invite you to purchase the book, to really engage these essays. And if I may, I'd like to ask my colleague, Dr. Morales Torres, whose chapter really gives a wonderful kind of reconstruction of a particular theological doctrine, the doctrine of creation. And I asked him just to use that as a kind of an entry point to close us out, to think about what's possible in rethinking religion, rethinking what we do, not only in theological education, but also in the world, to close our time on today.
Thank you, Dr. Ringer. And I want to thank the co-editors as well for the opportunity for me to write. I recognize that, if you can see, I'm not Black or African-American. I stand in a particular location. And so I am an invited guest into this conversation. So I'm humbled to have been extended that invitation. I also worry to say the last words of our gathering, at least in Puerto Rican context. If you say the last words at the restaurant, you're probably picking up the tab. So I would just pass that over to Dr. Ringer to pick that up. And but I do just want to close this out. This chapter was in some ways one of an invited guest, and in another sense, very deeply personal. I begin my chapter with an encounter I had at the age of 13 with police brutality, personally. And I wrote it on the same day that footage was revealed of a young Latino boy in a Latino neighborhood, shot down by police and killed. And he too was 13 years old. And so there was a lot of emotion happening. I was writing this. And I spoke about invisibilities and the way that racism works on a tactic of invisibility. And I frame even hypervisibility under this rubric. By using phenomenology, I explored the ways in which racism doesn't, we're conditioned to not see Black people. We're instead conditioned to see some caricature of a Black person, or I use monster theory, a monsterization of Black persons. But we never see Black people as people. That's the way the racist mechanisms work. And so I spoke about the invisibilities. I also spoke about brown invisibility and sometimes a rigid Black-white binary conversation that puts us in a weird conversational space, at the very least, to enter into this conversation. And then, of course, I spoke about white invisibility, that is, the ways in which white persons' privilege is invisible to them, either by choice or by ignorance. In my doctrine of creation, I decided to do what I do, which is a comparative theologian, and draw from without the Christian tradition. I drew from a Muslim scholar of the Middle Ages by the name of Ibn Arabi. And for him, he ties together creation with being seen. So that the gift of life, constitutive to that, is the gift of being seen as a sort of theological corrective for our ways in which we invisibilize particularly Black bodies, but also Black and brown bodies. And what I discovered when bringing in Ibn Arabi to Genesis 1 is that we always do a big deal about saying God saw that it was good, and we forget the first part of that sentence, which is God saw. There's this act of divine seeing that constitutes the creation, and argue for that if we're going to be liberative people, we need to see as God sees. And God sees in this Genesis passage, not in the generalities of all life matters, right? There's a particularization, a distinction, a distinguishing that's part of the act of creation. So particularity, difference, is part of this act of creation. And so to see in the particular is necessity. So I circle back to the ways in which we need to stop deferring Black people's struggles for other struggles, or quoting Dolores Williams, how we use Black struggle as a surrogate for other struggles. And I have seen time and time again, and actually been the prop for the ways in which we divert anti-Blackness conversations because they're too difficult to have. And we generalize racism conversations. And I'm arguing that if we're going to tackle racism at large, we have to address anti-Blackness directly, particular. And so I would hope that in closing that we might develop new optics and recognize that the gift of life comes with the gift of visibility, the gift of being seen, and that we might see in the particular. And particularly in this moment in history, that we see not just the struggle, but the resiliency of Black persons, and join them as we are able and as we are invited. And occasionally that and here I speak for non-Black persons, that our best tactic is just to get out the way and take the lead from Black persons who have been fighting for this, are in the thick of it, and listen to them and see them, not some caricature of them, not stereotypes, motifs, monsters, but to see Black persons and to take their lead in this struggle, not just against racism, but that which undergirds global racism, which I do think at the global level is anti-Blackness. So those are my words as parting words.
Thank you so much, Jose. Just as a final word, I appreciate Jose's comments about seeing. I think what these contributors have done in this volume, they have allowed us to see this movement differently. And they've allowed us to see religion differently. And they've allowed us to see our work, right, in this movement in very different ways. And so it's my hope that this volume will continue to live on, not only in your courses, not only in your own personal libraries, but also conversations in community. And wherever your work is, we hope that this volume will make a contribution to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.